I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. What are we looking at today, Rob?
We're looking at one I've been wanting to talk about for a while. Liu Cixin's The Three-Body Problem, winner of both the Hugo and Nebula Awards for Best Science Fiction Novel. One of the only books to do that, and definitely the first Chinese novel to do that.
So we're talking fairly contemporaneous?
Very contemporary, yeah, like within the last decade or so.
Okay.
The first book of a trilogy, but The Three-Body Problem is the one that kind of kicked it all off.
And it's definitely the most famous.
Of those three, I would say, yeah, for sure.
It's his most famous work, isn't it?
Well, it's the trilogy certainly is. He's been writing in science fiction in China for quite a while, and is arguably the most notable, perhaps the best current writer of science fiction in China. So the novel itself is, or at least sounds like, kind of a boilerplate science fiction
Sounds
novel.
really bad.
It sounds, yeah. If you don't like, okay, this is where we get into problems with genre fiction, quote unquote. Like whenever you talk about, technically anything written in novel form is genre fiction because you can't not. It's like, well, this is realist fiction. It's no genre at all. Yeah,
it's like the non-denominational denomination.
Exactly. But anyway, so this is because it's genre fiction. Most people sort of roll their eyes. And let's be fair. A lot of the conventions of the science fiction genre are sort of eye-roll worthy.
And I'm going to have to say, a lot of people who read science fiction, I'm looking at my brother, not Rob Moore, because Rob Moore is not actually my real brother. My actual brother who likes science fiction. It's really bad. Like, it's just hard to read. If you're only reading it for the ideas and the story, a lot of times it's only written for the ideas and the stories. No one oftentimes people in science fiction don't care about the writing.
Right. And that's one of the problems. This is one of the problems whenever we get into questions of literature with a capital L and people talk about science fiction because...
Did you just mention the L word?
I mentioned the L word. And it's a fair critique. I mean, I love science fiction. My favorite writer in high school was Isaac Asimov.
But you've told me before, a lot of times you just read bad science fiction to just veg out.
Sometimes you do. It's the same reason people watch dumb TV shows. And let's face it, everyone does at some point. Like, you can defend your dumb TV shows and say, well, this is actually really deep. It's not. It's dumb. That's why you're watching it. It's because it's a dumb TV show. Anyway, but, I feel like the vast majority of science fiction novels I've read are pretty forgettable, to put it nicely. But the ones that aren't are pretty amazing.
And, I mean, we can even think about this in terms of English, which I think is where most of our listeners are coming from. Kurt Vonnegut's one of the most amazing writers of the latter half of the 20th century, and I think some people do classify him as science fiction. I'm not entirely sure if I'm comfortable with that, but he's definitely, especially if you look at his earlier works, he's coming out of a science fiction tradition.
Slaughterhouse-Five involves a character kidnapped by aliens. That's about as science fiction as it gets.
And similarly, I hadn't thought of the kind of corollary, but Slaughterhouse-Five, like Three-Body Problem, they're both using this alien thing to deal with this very radical, violent period and try and understand it.
And that's a really good segue, because the plot of The Three-Body Problem is basically an alien invasion, but the book doesn't get to any notion of alien invasion until about 75% of the way through. Most of what happens before then either takes place during the Cultural Revolution or deals with the political aftermath of the Cultural Revolution.
Just help the listener out here. An alien invasion does happen, right?
Eventually, yes. Well, this is the trick, though, and I feel like I'm going to be giving things away, but what makes the series so interesting is that there is an alien invasion, but it's coming. It's not here yet. So the series explores the years because they know the aliens are coming, but it's like 400 years in the future. So what does the world do to prepare for this thing? That's kind of the series. What makes, for me, The Three-Body Problem so interesting is, first, it's being rooted in the Cultural Revolution. I don't know any science fiction novels that deal with that. And second, it does it in a way that sets a lot of the conventions of sort of alien invasion stories completely on their heads. In this book, for example, and I won't say the name of the character or what they do specifically, but there's a character who essentially, because of the destruction wrought on their lives by the Cultural Revolution, makes a decision on their own that enables the alien invasion. And this character makes that decision knowing that it means the destruction of all human life on Earth, and decides it's a good call because human beings don't deserve to survive. And this becomes a view shared by a lot of people in the novel. So I've never experienced a story like this where a significant portion of the characters want to be destroyed.
So could you, Rob, just give the listener a brief plot summary?
So the basic idea of the plot is that the story starts out in the Cultural Revolution, and there's a character whose father is killed by the Red Guards at Peking University. She herself is a gifted astrophysicist, and in order to escape being politically purged, signs up with a work unit in Mongolia. And through a series of events, becomes involved in a top-secret project in the mountains. Later in the story... Well, the story jumps back and forth between the Cultural Revolution events and the events of the current day. And in the current day, there's another character who's involved in sort of high-tech research on nanomaterials. And this particular character begins to realize certain things are not the way they're supposed to be in the world around him. He starts seeing a countdown appear in his photographs, and it only appears for him, for example. That sort of thing. Anyway, the characters go back and forth, and you begin to uncover a sort of global net of people who are involved in an online game called The World of the Three-Body Problem. And it's a weird sort of story within a story thing where the character signs on to the internet to play this game. And in every iteration of the game, there's a world that's destroyed because it's orbiting 3 suns. So no matter what they do, their civilization always gets destroyed, and they're trying to figure out a way around this. And by about 3/4 of the way through, and this is a bit of a spoiler, so if you don't want to know, just stop the podcast and skip, that the game itself is actually set up by an alien race whose world does orbit 3 suns and is systematically annihilated, and so their civilization can't advance too far. Now, what's interesting with all of this is because it involves a lot of cutting-edge science, but the twist in the novel, and I won't tell you how they do this, but the aliens' way of defeating humanity ahead of time is to make all science dealing with any kind of fundamental ideas, like the atom, quantum physics, impossible to do anymore on Earth. And I won't say how they do it because it's super interesting, and it's a reason to read the novel is to figure this out. But by the end of the book, the characters realize the aliens are coming. There's no way to advance the science they have beyond a certain point. And at least a good portion of the human race wants humanity to be destroyed.
That gets to a larger question. What does the Cultural Revolution do for this novel? Like, why base a science fiction novel on the Cultural Revolution? And is this kind of desire for death that humanity has coming out of the kind of craziness and the inhumanity of the Cultural Revolution?
Well, it's coming out of things like it. Different characters in the book who are believers in this have experienced similar horrors. One notable character has been doing research on an island, but multinational corporations have clear-cut all the vegetation, or are clear-cutting it, and essentially destroying the entire ecosystem. And he's looking at the destruction of things that have been there for millions of years, and he's thinking, what are we doing? Like, who are we anymore? Having it based in the Cultural Revolution, I think, well, it's important for Chinese culture in particular, but in terms of global events, it's interesting as well because it's still a fairly contemporary event. Like, this isn't ancient history. This is within the last 60, 70 years, 50, 60 years, I guess.
Some of my teachers experienced the Cultural Revolution.
But it's not something people talk about.
And that's particularly true in China. I would actually say it's more true in China than it is in the U.S. The first rule of the Cultural Revolution, if you don't mind me saying so, is that you don't talk about the Cultural Revolution.
It's the Fight Club of Chinese history.
But it's fascinating because I teach Chinese students, and sometimes we discuss the Cultural Revolution, and they know nothing about it. So what is happening in I'm curious, like, what is the reception of this novel in
Well, the
China?
novel is hugely popular. They're making a movie out of it. So it's all on the page. The main character, Ye Wenjie, loses her father to overzealous Red Guards who beat him to death in front of her. She submits a report to her work unit and then is politically persecuted for it, even though it wasn't her idea. She ends up working on this top secret science project in the mountains, and yet her superiors treat her like a little girl, basically. So nothing about this experience is hidden in any way. And that's one of the other things that's interesting is that although you're not really supposed to teach about the Cultural Revolution, it's still a part of popular culture.
And I was just going to add Yu Hua's novel, which was incredibly popular in 2006, 2007, Brothers, 兄弟. It also is all about the Cultural Revolution and kind of dealing with that. So it's not that the Cultural Revolution is never discussed in sort of print media, but there are a lot of restrictions on how you can talk about it. And even in print, I think there are certain things you can't say.
And honestly, let's put this out there. One of the reasons could be because this is a science fiction story.
I was
it's a
gonna ask
genre
that, yeah.
fiction, sort of goofy. It's perceived as goofy. So
Does the fact that it is genre fiction, the fact that it's kind of like not part of mainstream literary culture, allows the three-body problem to duck these questions.
And what's interesting about this is not a new technique. This has been around a long time. You had Ming-Qing writers setting a story in a fictional place or dealing with a different sort of dynasty when actually what they're talking about is the current dynasty.
Yeah, I guess that reminds me particularly of Jinghua Yuan, the story of these girls who go, and I mean, it's a series of women who go sailing to another country or a bunch of different countries. And they are definitely kind of like commenting. It's a very Swiftian novel. Is there any effort in the three-body problem? Is it drawing off of that tradition? I mean, is it explicitly drawing off that tradition?
I don't know that I could say it's explicitly drawing off it because you don't see any obvious markers there. It's not allegorical, certainly. It's not saying, it's not giving us something that's like the Cultural Revolution. It is the Cultural Revolution, but because you have aliens and sort of fantastic premises, you can get away with talking about things you couldn't otherwise. But what's interesting about it is that Liu Cixin, the author, jumps back and forth between stuff that's happening in the Cultural Revolution and stuff in the present day. Now, stuff in the present day doesn't involve the Cultural Revolution at all. Like, you don't see the fingerprints anywhere. It's a completely different world, right? It's modern China. It's high-tech China. It's a world in which Chinese science is the cutting-edge science. It's leading the way, right? The scientists who are uncovering the stuff about nanomaterials and aliens are Chinese scientists. They're not coming from other countries. So it's kind of almost a utopian look at modern China, but Cixin keeps jumping us back to a point when China was awful, just a horrible place, and that juxtaposition is really interesting. The cool, modern, contemporary, cutting-edge China and the political turmoil China.
Does the novel have any kind of attempt to draw lines between those two, or is it completely independent? The two.
They're very independent. Although the characters, the main character, Ye Wenjie, was in the Cultural Revolution, and she's in the modern day one too. So she kind of bridges the two. But she's arguably the only one. Now, by the end of the novel, you realize that the stuff that was happening in the Cultural Revolution, the science happening there, does relate to the alien invasion. That's one of the surprises in the book. So I can tell you what exactly is done. Of course, if you've read the genre, you know something like this probably is going on. But there's no real bridge either. This is happening now, this is happening then. So one of the things that I wanted to add to this is that it points out kind of an interesting line between official and popular culture in China. So there's the stuff that everybody's supposed to read and think about, like Du Fu, like Li Bai, like Mao Zedong, etc., Marx. And then there's the stuff that everyone actually does read and think about, right? vernacular fiction. These days, a lot more internet fiction. We recently saw a statistic where something like 35% or 40%
40%
of internet traffic, or of the traffic that is on the internet in China, is internet literature. People are signing on looking for stuff to read, which is fascinating and definitely not just different versions of Dufu, right? So there's the stuff that everyone knows and talks about in cafes and bars, and then there's the stuff that you're supposed to learn about in school and talk about on TV.
And
right?
this definitely fits into that kind of non-official category.
Yes, except that now with all the international acclaim, you can't really avoid it in official circles. I mean, you're not going to teach it in school by any means, but...
Can I ask, you mentioned several awards that this book has won. How has it been received internationally otherwise? Have people reacted to it?
Well, that's what I mean. The Hugo and Nebula Awards are international science fiction awards. Yeah.
But how do they deal with the Cultural Revolution? Because I'm guessing international audiences are a lot less aware of what's happening during the Cultural Revolution.
Well, I mean, I taught this novel in a course over the summer.
Okay.
And my students here at the University of Oregon had never heard of the Cultural Revolution. But Liu Cixin does a very good job at presenting the conflict in a way that you understand what's going on, right? It's political persecution. Anyone can understand what that is, really, right? So in some ways, the Cultural Revolution is presented as I don't want to say a standard example of political persecution, but there's elements that you will read in any novel involving communist Russia, Nazi Germany, any regime like that has elements of this. So my students didn't find it difficult to get through this. They found the names difficult. They found the locations difficult, but the actual events they were right on board with.
So this would be the kind of a pretty good novel for people who are trying to start looking into Chinese science fiction.
Oh yeah, this is sort of the classic modern example for sure.
You say classic.
I know, right? It's not going to be classic and modern, I know. But I would also recommend this for anyone who's like, Cultural Revolution, what the heck? What's that about? Because this isn't a documentary, but what you're reading from the Cultural Revolution is fairly accurate and very moving as well. You have a character who's essentially emotionally cauterized by the tragedy, just literally can't feel anything for anyone anymore because of the things that have happened to her. And that's worth reading to see these effects and how they came about.
I think that's a good place to end it. Do you have any more thoughts?
Nope, that's all I've got.
All right. Well, I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.